The middle class has always been the seat of morality, of restraint, of discipline, and thrift. Peter Drucker.
How much does class affect morality? Is one's virtue determined by social and economic circumstance, or is more intrinsically motivated? That one is more of a philosophical question, but I am going to address the perceptions behind class and virtue and why, based on a purely economic basis, the middle class has the most incentive to be virtuous. Welcome to Analyzing Finance with Nick. There have been many great thinkers such as Thomas Jefferson and Alexis de Tocqueville, Peter Drucker, and many others who have basically say the backbone of America and the backbone of prosperous society is built on a strong and healthy middle class. And the reason why is that middle class people inherently are more virtuous. But why would middle class be more virtuous? Is that just the sentiment of people who grew up in the middle class trying to disparage the elites and disparage those in poverty? I personally do think there's something more to it because you look at the incentives and what encourages moral behavior. I know there are religious beliefs and religious beliefs motivate people of all social classes to behave in a way that is considered moral for their faith. But this is not analyzing theology with Nick. So I'm going to analyze this from a more secular perspective. So if you look at secular economic incentives, though, what social classes are incentivized to behave well and which ones are incentivized to behave poorly? Generally, the lower classes have very little incentive for virtue. Why do I say this? One, because they have really nothing to lose from bad behavior. Their situation is already fairly bad. They're in the bottom of the social hierarchy. They're often struggling to survive for basic needs, or they're dependent on the state to survive. And given how unequal a lot of social hierarchies are and limited social mobility is, no amount of virtuous behavior is going to change that, or it'll take such a large amount of personal discipline and virtuous behavior to change that a lot of people just figured it's not worth it. So a lot of stereotypically bad working class habits, family patterns, and a variety of what is considered immoral behavior, oftentimes, and the propensity of vices is oftentimes the most common in the working and lower classes, even though a lot of them would come off as socially conservative in their politics, especially in recent years. They live a far different way. The working classes have the highest rates of not getting married. They have the highest rates of having children out of wedlock. They have the highest rates of substance abuse. They have the highest rate of crime, highest rates of violent crime. For those who do get married, the highest rates of divorce, the lowest rates of educational attainment, and the lowest rates of church attendance. So overall, a lot of the data would conflate with the idea that the working classes tend to lack virtue. And from an economic perspective, it makes sense because they're going to be poor. They're going to be struggling to get by. So they might as well enjoy life now and do more short-term utility-seeking behavior because there really is no long-term to strive for that's going to be better. So that is my opinion that explains why you would see a lot of the lower classes be less virtuous. And also it could be a product of people who are naturally less virtuous are more likely to make bad decisions that even if they grew up in a higher social class, that ultimately will sink them down. So there are regional, and I'm talking about virtuous sense of like behavior that leads to good socioeconomic outcomes for the individual and often at times the community as a whole. And so this negative selection bias of those who were in previous classes moving down due to this bad behavior also adds to the idea that virtue is not necessarily high among the lower classes. You look at the upper classes, they got the similar problem, but for the opposite reasons. The elites, particularly the old money elites, are protected from consequences. I mean, in American society and many other countries in the world, if you have enough money and enough social connections, you could sometimes be above the law, or you can really be immune. If you're not above the law, you could be immune to a lot of the negative consequences of bad behavior. If you're wealthy, you could finance an addiction for a much longer period of time, if not indefinitely, than somebody in the middle class or lower. If you have a ton of broken marriages and broken family structures, which may be financially impossible for a middle-class person to be able to skate through. If you're wealthy enough, you can afford that burden and not really face any real major consequences in your life. The divorce rate is actually the highest within the sort of subset of population among billionaires. The very elites have higher divorce rates than even the working class and lower classes who get married. And it's because there's really no financial consequences to their bad behavior, because they have so much money, they can kind of get away with anything. And that's why a lot of the elites tend to be socially liberal, because they want mainstream society to validate some of their more morally deviant or unpopular choices. And that makes sense. Again, if you have unlimited resources and you don't really have any negative social or economic consequences, or if there are negative social consequences, you don't care because you have enough money for at least your entire life, if not generations after. You have really no reason to conform to middle-class culture whatsoever. And if you do get in real trouble, you have the connections to help you get out of it. So that explains on the other side why the elites may not have the incentive to be virtuous, because they have the unlimited money and power to get away with suboptimal behavior. So, and I also talked about this in my social class and dating video I did in February, where the control-seeking people are more likely in the lower classes and the upper classes, because their economic situation makes them factor in more economic realities. So the middle class, from a secular perspective, not a perspective, has the most incentive to be virtuous, and for a number of reasons. First, not being virtuous and doing the wrong things economically and morally has the most consequences for this class. If you fail to get your education, you're not going to be able to have the earning power to get a job to keep you in the middle class, and you'll move down. If you do something scandalous and ruin your credibility socially, you could lose your source of employment and be harder to get hired back on in your community and move down. Downward class mobility is a lot more real for the middle class and the other classes. The upper class, those are generally protected due to generational wealth. The lower classes are already at the bottom, so they don't really worry about going any lower because they can't. But the middle class is on the fine line of downward class mobility, and downward class mobility is often a consequence of unvirtuous behavior. So those are two examples: is job security and middle class income. The middle class's fortunes are also tied to a single employer, whether it's a government or a private business. And their reputational damage only has to influence the decision of one person. If you have multiple diverse sources of income, or even ones like dividend checks, which are not based on your personal reputation, then you have a lot more flexibility to have more devious behavior, whereas a middle-class person simply does not. And in addition to just social pressure, which is the big reason for a lot of middle-class behavior, or the risk of professional downside mobility for lack of education or reputational damage, there's also just the simple cost of maintaining these abnormal, amoral, or immoral behaviors. Like an addiction is going to destroy the finances quicker of a middle-class person than it would of a lower class person or an upper class person. Failed marriages and broken families also have much more impact on moving you down a class ladder when you're in any of the middle classes, whether it's the professional classes, anything basically successful business class owner to precariat. A divorce will move you down one rung on the social class 9 out of 10 times. And so therefore, the cost for divorce for the middle and professional classes is severely higher than in the lower classes and the upper classes, who it basically doesn't really cost them much at all. Same with children. Like raising children that are not in the same home as you and have to pay for 2 homes, whether through because of a divorce or having a child out of wedlock in a non-monogamous relationship, has a much higher cost for a middle-class person to maintain that than keeping everybody in the same household as a married couple does, than in the upper class and the lower classes who really don't have to worry about those costs. Same with getting good grades in school. Like if the lower class doesn't get good grades in school, their life it'll just stay bad. It really won't get as worse. Same with the upper class. Like they'll find some way to put the not so intelligent child of nobility in some like random job to make them look like a productive member of society and maintain their standard of living. But the middle class, their whole fortune, whether college they get into, and as a derivative of that, what kind of jobs they can get is dependent on their academic performance. And so that's another thing. And in order to help codify this behavior, a lot of religious faith and related activities are more appealing because it gives you a framework to keep you on the right track. Is more important for a middle class person for their economic reasons than, again, the others who are either too insulated from consequences or they're already at the bottom, so the consequences don't really have the same negative impact to somebody who has something to lose. The middle class has the most to lose in the system in terms of the quality of their life declining from the wrong choices. And that economic incentive probably explains at least 80% of why the middle class is more virtuous and possibly more. Is it really simple, though, as economic incentives that drive morality? Do you think that the middle class is more moral than the other classes for the reasons I say? Or do you think I'm wrong that every class has the same level of morality? Or the elites are more moral? Leave that in the comments. But I will leave one last note about the elites and the wealthy, because there is a counter argument that the old money is actually the most noble and morally upright class, because since they do not have the economic pressures to conform to mainstream society like the middle class does, they are the only truly objective people. They can make decisions based on absolute right and absolute wrong, even if it's socially unpopular. They don't have to worry about social pressure or if social trends are moving against them. And that's why a lot of societies ideally wanted an aristocracy to rule, because the aristocracy could make the right decisions for not only for the present of the nation, but the future generations as well, because their families' fortunes are dependent on the future being as prosperous as is today, but also the fact that they don't have immediate economic pressure, whether it's maintaining their office through the voters or through having to maintain their job like a middle-class person would. And so they have the flexibility to make the best decisions because they are that same immunity to consequences, which you can argue would make somebody less moral, could also help you become more moral and make the best choices, because your personal self-interest is not going to be materially changed enough one way or the other to influence you to make a more selfish decision. Is the middle class the most moral, or is the upper class, the lower class all equal, or none of the above? I want to hear your comments. I want to have this a greater conversation. And if you have any ideas for ways I can branch off on this conversation, also leave those in the chat. Thank you for watching.